When when did you think, okay, well, I will write fiction, and then why specifically middle grade or picture books, children-oriented fiction?
So I think once I had that chance and that taste of children's writing and realized it was something I wanted to keep doing, around the same time I became a mom. And so I was taking my son back to the same library I had grown up going to before they bulldozed it. And I was really looking for representation that I didn't have as a kid. And when I was growing up and I was filling up those bags with books, I wasn't aware of the fact that my story was missing or that I wasn't on the pages. I wasn't consciously aware of that. I think I subconsciously was, and I know now, looking back at even the things I wrote, that I was colored by not having seen myself. Um, but I definitely wanted my children to have the representation that was missing. And I kind of just assumed that it would be there. All these years had passed since I was a little kid, and so I did actively go look for literature featuring Pakistani-American Muslim kids like mine, and I couldn't find anything. And it was really my son being in preschool and being asked by one of the teaching assistants during a Ramadan party to read something to the kids. And she had actually printed something off the internet about what Ramadan is and offered for me to read it to the kids. And I was feeling a little shy. I wasn't used to presenting to kids back then. So I was like, no, why don't you go ahead? And so she started reading, and it was just this horribly boring, Wikipedia type entry about what Ramadan is, using words that kids couldn't understand. And these are 4 and 5, like 3 and 4 and 5 year olds who were just completely bored and confused. And that's what made me realize that, there's nothing that's appropriate. The books that I could find that featured, Muslim characters were either written by Muslim publishers for the purposes of teaching people how to practice their faith, like sort of like, Quran stories for little hearts, or, things like that. Or there were super referencey books like by National Geographic about, what is Ramadan, or, that type of very, very basic nonfiction book, but nothing with a story, nothing that really simplified things down to the perspective of a kid, nothing that to me made the holidays feel accessible and relatable. So for me, that was what I thought. Well, we need this, and that was sort of the idea that launched Night of the Moon, which was my first picture book. So it was very much in reaction to seeing what was not in existence at the time, and wanting to really, with the school library and public library audience in mind, wanting to create something that fit that space. And when I got to publish Night of the Moon, which came out with Chronicle Books, which was wonderful, and I love them. They create really beautiful books and little works of art, I think, with amazing paper and foil on the cover and things like that. I thought, well, that was fun. I wrote a book, and even though I had the scholastic titles under my belt, I still didn't feel like I could call myself an author. I didn't really consider myself a professional writer. And then time passed, and I thought, oh, well, the Ramadan book is great, but it's still a holiday book. Like, it would be really nice to go to a bookstore and see a book. I noticed that even on the little section that had the religious section, or whatever you want to call it, they had, books about Christianity and books about mostly, and then a few books about Judaism, and then nothing about Islam. And I realized that the Night of the Moon was a seasonal book that would be ordered during the holidays and come and go. So that's when I thought of Golden Domes and Silver Lanterns, which is a concept book that introduces colors, but also introduces things that are special to Muslim people. And I think with both my first picture books, I tried to sell it as something bigger than a story just about Muslims. So Night of the Moon was about the lunar cycle and about Ramadan, and Golden Domes and Silver Lanterns is a book, you learn about colors and learn about Muslims. And I felt like I needed that hook to try to convince publishers that it was worth something, but also, maybe to try to gain as wide a readership as possible. And so it sort of grew from that. That was sort of what made me want to publish books about people like me. And then it sort of evolved from that, and the industry evolved. And I feel like, the Curious George Ramadan book came along, and others. And then I think the middle grade novel, Amina's Voice, my first one, really grew out of it being representing the type of book I would have loved as a kid and would have wanted to have read. And in many ways, Amina is like me, a child of immigrants, growing up, although she's growing up in today's world, like, just trying to figure out life um, and, an everyday kid. And that was to me really important to have that representation where her identity is not her struggle. And I think when I was growing up, the few books I did see where a person was non-white or, maybe coming from a different culture or had parents who were immigrants, I felt like the common story was a bit of insecurity or, self-hatred almost about, why am I this way? Or why do my parents have an accent? Or why can't I be like, this kid at school? And then maybe coming to accept themselves or their culture and being proud. But I felt like that was so done. And I really wanted my characters to not, for their identity, for not to be their issue. And for them to be unapologetically who they are and deal with regular kid challenges that all kids go through.
I definitely want to ask just a little bit more about representation, but first, a cynical question jumps to mind that I can't help myself from asking.
Sure.
If you have the option for 2 picture books, one about colors that can sell all year long, but one that's about a holiday that can come back every year and you can go back and promote it every year, you've got both, but which is preferable?
Well, I did mention Ramadan in Golden Domes and Silver Lanterns also.
Covering all the bases. I like
Yeah. I mean, just because it's such an important part of the faith. But yeah, I mean, honestly, both. And, I'm grateful that these books are still backlisting well. Night of the Moon came out in 2008, so it's been around for a long time and it's still in print. And so that's amazing to see. And just the reception that these books have gotten, those two, I think, were what prompted the Ramadan Curious George book. And it's sort of in the slow build where people, I think the industry is slowly realizing too, that these books have value, that people do want them. And they can make money off of them because obviously at the end of the day, that's what they care about. So, I mean, apart from changing the world and enriching people's, lives, of course, but
can't do it that the lights don't stay on. Sure.
Exactly. It's a business. So they need to see that these are profitable for them too. So yeah, I think I might have trailed off and forgotten your question or half of it.
I was just, it wasn't a very serious question. I was just wondering for picture book artists who are thinking that they may only they might only be able to choose one. Is it better to have a consistent seller or get that sweet holiday seller? And every year, you've got another shot at, okay, this year we're in quarantine, but next year I'll be back at the bookstores and the libraries.
Yeah, well, I do think a lot of people, I mean, you do see a lot of books around events, like the spooky books that are coming out now for Halloween, and they're doing great right now. But of course, they have that limited time frame, and you hope that. But I think you can't go wrong with either or both.
Well, I mean, ideally, you have a nice long career and you write plenty of each. So talking just a little bit about representation, then we'll start talking about your book specifically.
Sure.
But what difference do you feel that having books about Muslim American characters would have made for you as a child reader? And what difference do you see it making for readers that are enjoying your books now? And also, what's your favorite reader reaction to something you've written?
Oh, wow. So I think, well, I mentioned that I know that it did make a difference in my life, even though I didn't realize it when I was a kid. And I think like so many people, when you don't realize what's missing in your life until you finally see it. And I think for me, it wasn't until I was 30 that I first picked up a book and felt like I had that, what Walter Dean Myers called the shock of recognition and seeing myself on a page. And it was The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. And it wasn't even that, the characters were exactly like me. They were a Bangladeshi-American family. The protagonist was male. It wasn't like, oh, this is exactly me. But the immigrant experience, this immigrant family, and the main character's mother was so reminiscent of my mom that it was jarring and amazing and powerful to see, and so incredibly validating too to see your story on a page. And it took me that long, to be 30. And and even though I didn't realize it as a kid, I had started looking probably in college a bit more and started reading South Asian literature, which I could relate to a point, but it was still mostly people in India writing about being Indian, and I could identify with certain cultural elements, and a sari or a mango or things like that that were significant to me, but it still wasn't my story. And how I realized eventually that, apart from starting to look for the representation as I got older, I think what made me realize that it did affect me was going back and reading my own writing from when I was a child. And I actually wrote a family newspaper, and I talked about what was happening in my family, and I had issues of it. I used to tape it together. It was like lined notebook paper, and I had different sections, and it was really fascinating to find a bunch of these in a box. I used to save my writing, and it was like this time capsule, going back and reading about my thoughts as a fourth grader or whatever I was when I was writing it. And what I noticed, and I talk about this when I talk to kids, and I show them actually scanned pages of my family newspaper, and how even though I had sections devoted to food and very specific aspects of life, I did not mention anything about my background or culture. So even though I grew up in a Pakistani-American household and we ate Pakistani food almost every night, there was Urdu being spoken at home. My mother wore shalwar kameez, our traditional clothing, every day. I was Muslim family, Muslim traditions, and all of that. Like, none of that was in my own family newspaper. And I can only imagine that I left all those details out because I thought nobody cared about them. I wasn't seeing them anywhere else, not in any of the literature I was consuming, not in the media, not in television or film or anywhere else. So
is this a newspaper to be consumed just by your family or for the school as well?
Oh no, this was a family newspaper that was really probably read by nobody, which maybe my parents read it. It did include a lot of hints for them. It was like a lot of tattling on my siblings, and what I wanted, for my birthday and things like that, woven into editorial letters and things like that. But yeah, it was just for fun. And and that was where, when people ask me, did you always want to be a writer? I think I did always want to be a writer, and I always was a writer. I just never thought it was something I could do. And I didn't know any authors. I'd never met any. We didn't have the internet back then, so I couldn't even check to see if an author I knew or an author I liked was alive or dead. They were just names on books for me. So it wasn't even something I thought I could do. And the only author picture I ever saw was this woman, Barbara Cartland, Dame Barbara Cartland. She wrote historical fiction romances, and my mom had a collection of them. And on the back cover of the book, there was a picture of her, and she's this imposing woman. She's silver haired, and she's wearing fur, and she's sitting on gilded furniture with a little dog. And to me, that was what an author was. It wasn't anything like me, so it wasn't anything I considered. But I think the lack of representation really added to that too. And I can only imagine what it might have been like had I seen myself, and what stories I might have felt comfortable sharing about myself in my own life. And now, just to see, the other part of your question, kids react to seeing themselves. I mean, it's amazing to have kids, even when I visit schools, if I mention certain things, or when they've read, parts of my books, or they can identify with things I'm talking about, to see them, kind of bursting inside, or like squirming, or making the connection sign, or doing all this stuff because they finally see someone like themselves. And just some of the letters I've gotten about, kids saying that they felt prouder about who they were, or how they, just in their own words, they're basically saying that they finally felt seen, and how validating that is for them in different ways. So I think the most moving letter I ever got was from a little girl talking about how, she felt prouder to be who she was, and that it made that kind of difference in her life. And I was just like, wow. So yeah, things like that.
You take a letter like that and you frame it where you can see it while you
exactly.
write?
I have a special folder where I save them all. And when I have those moments where I'm like, nobody loves me, then I pull them out, and it makes me feel better. But yeah. Definitely.
I'm jealous. That sounds like a heck of a letter.
Yeah, no, it really was. And yeah, they're definitely something I save and draw from whenever I can.